Every December, in shopping malls and concert halls and churches across North America and Europe, a melody plays that most people can hum from memory. For notes, repeated and built upon, ascending and returning, building from a single voice to a cathedral of sound. Most people who know it call it, Carol of the Bells. Almost none of them know that it is a Ukrainian folk chant called Shchedryk, the generous one. That it was composed in a village on the Podillya plateau in 1901, that it reached Carnegie Hall in 1922, and that the man who arranged it was shot in his bed by a Soviet secret police agent 18 months before that Carnegie Hall performance. He was 43 years old. He never knew what his music would become. Mykola Dmytrovich Leontovych is one of the great invisible figures in world music history. Invisible, that is, in the Western canon, where his name appears in footnotes while his melody fills arenas. In Ukraine, he is something else entirely, a national hero, a martyr, the composer who proved that Ukrainian folk music was not a regional curiosity but a source of infinite artistic depth, and who paid for that proof with his life under a regime that understood exactly what he represented. Podillya, where the music came from. Leontovych was born on December 13, 1877, in the village of Monastyrok on the Podillya plateau in what is now the Vinnytsia region of Ukraine. The region was, in the late 19th century, part of the Russian Empire, where Ukrainian language and culture existed under sustained official pressure. Ukrainian was banned from schools, from church, from publishing, from public life. The music that filled Leontovych's childhood was therefore not a heritage that was celebrated or promoted. It was something people carried privately, in the home, in the fields, in the village ceremonies that continued despite official discouragement. His father Dmitro was a village priest who played cello, violin, and piano and directed the local choir. His mother Maria had a fine voice and knew an enormous repertoire of Ukrainian folk songs. The house was full of music in the way that only houses can be when music is not performance but habit. Siblings singing together, instruments appearing at meals, the liturgical calendar marking the year with specific songs for specific occasions. The shchedrivky, the generous ones, the New Year's songs that were sung going door to door asking for gifts, were part of this cycle, ancient melodic formulas connected to pre-Christian spring celebrations that had survived centuries of religious change by attaching themselves to the Christian calendar while keeping their older imagery. The swallow returning, the livestock multiplying, the household blessed with abundance. Leontovych absorbed this music not as a student collecting folklore but as a child for whom it was simply the sound of the world. When he began working with it as a composer, he was not translating folk material into an alien classical vocabulary. He was making explicit what was already there. The polyphonic potential of music that village singers had been developing by ear for generations without academic names for what they were doing. The seminary and the decision. As the son of a priest, Leontovych's educational path was already drawn. He attended the Shchedryk primary religious school from 1887 to 1892, then the Podillya Theological Seminary in Kamyanets-Podilsky from 1892 to 1899. The seminary was a rigorous institution where music was part of the curriculum but not the center of it. The center was preparation for ordination. Leontovych spent 7 years learning theology, Latin, and sacred music while increasingly understanding that what he wanted to do with his life had nothing to do with the priesthood. What the seminary did give him, unexpectedly, was the technical vocabulary he needed. He studied harmony, counterpoint, choral conducting, and the principles of voice leading that would become the foundation of his compositional method. He began arranging Ukrainian folk songs during his seminary years, experimenting with harmonizations that preserved the modal character of the melodies, their ancient Dorian and Mixolydian inflections, rather than forcing them into the major-minor framework that Western European academic harmony demanded. He understood, intuitively and then increasingly analytically, that the folk music he had grown up with operated according to principles that were not inferior to the Western system but different from it, and that the task of a Ukrainian composer was to make those principles audible rather than to obscure them. After graduation he made the decision that would define the rest of his life: he would not be ordained. He would teach. He took positions in village schools across Podillya and later in the Donbass region, in the settlement of Hrushin, now known as Pokrovsk, teaching children, organizing choirs and small orchestras, establishing musical education in communities that had none. For nearly 2 decades he worked in this way, in relative obscurity, while simultaneously refining his compositional technique and working on the arrangements that would eventually make him famous. Shchedryk, 20 years of refinement. The first version of Shchedryk dates to 1901. Leontovych was 23 years old, teaching in a village school, and he had taken a 4-note melodic fragment, one of the most ancient surviving examples of Ukrainian folk melody, connected to the pre-Christian New Year celebration in spring, and built it into a choral work of perhaps 3 minutes. He was not satisfied with it. He revised it. He revised it again. Over the next 18 years he produced multiple versions, adjusting the harmonization, refining the voice leading, reconsidering the dynamic architecture of the piece. The version most often performed today is the 1919 revision, the final form he gave it before his death. What Leontovych had discovered in Shchedryk was a compositional principle that would organize his entire mature output. The idea that a folk melody could be developed not through the Western European techniques of thematic transformation or development but through the native Ukrainian practice of Podillya, the independent accompanying voices that village singers naturally added to a main melody, each voice having its own linear logic while all voices together created a harmonic texture richer than any single voice could produce. The choral texture of Shchedryk grows from one voice to many not through harmonization, the chord supporting a single melody, but through the gradual entry of independent melodic lines that interweave around the original 4-note figure. It sounds simple because the idea is simple. Its execution requires extraordinary control of vocal texture and dynamic balance, and Leontovych spent nearly 2 decades getting it right. The premiere took place on Christmas Day 1916, performed by the choir of Kiev University under the conductor Alexander Koshits. The audience response was extraordinary. The piece was performed again, and began to spread through Ukrainian choral circles with the speed of something that answers a need people did not know they had. The Ukrainian Republican Capella, music as diplomacy. The years 1917 to 1921 were the years of the Ukrainian Revolution. The period when, following the collapse of the Russian Empire, Ukraine declared independence as the Ukrainian People's Republic and fought, ultimately without success, to maintain that independence against Bolshevik military pressure from the east and White Army pressure from the south. Leontovych was a conscious Ukrainian patriot who understood that the cultural dimension of this struggle was as important as the military one, and he threw himself into the project of establishing Ukrainian musical institutions. In 1918 he moved to Kiev, the new capital, and began teaching at the Mykola Lysenko Music and Drama Institute while reorganizing Ukrainian choral ensembles and working on sacred music, including the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, which combined the framework of Orthodox Church music with specifically Ukrainian melodic idioms. He wrote educational materials for Ukrainian schools, worked on collecting and cataloging folk songs, and participated in the broader project of building a Ukrainian cultural infrastructure that could represent the nation to itself and to the world. The most visible expression of this project was the Ukrainian Republican Capella, directed by Alexander Koshits, which the government of the Ukrainian People's Republic sent on an international tour in 1919 to 1921. The tour was not merely a cultural exchange, it was a political mission. Ukraine was trying to gain international recognition as an independent state, and music was the most immediate and least contentious way to demonstrate that Ukrainian culture was real, deep, and worthy of international engagement. The capella performed in Germany, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Switzerland, France, England, and eventually the United States, and everywhere it performed, the response to the Ukrainian repertoire, and especially to Shchedryk, was overwhelming. On October 5, 1922, the capella performed at Carnegie Hall in New York. The concert was a triumph. Ukrainian music, and through it Ukrainian cultural identity, reached the most prestigious concert stage in the Western Hemisphere. Leontovych, who had been unable to travel with the capella, was in Tulchin when the Carnegie Hall concert took place. He had been forced back to Podillya by the Bolshevik occupation of Kiev. He never learned what happened that night in New York. The key of years and the work that remained unfinished. In the brief window between the Ukrainian Revolution and the final Bolshevik consolidation of control, Leontovych worked with an intensity that suggests he knew time was limited. He was completing Shchedryk in its final form in 1919. He was working on the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. He was beginning an opera, Na Ruzalkin Belikdin, on the Mermaid's Easter, based on a fairy tale by the Ukrainian writer Boris Hrynchenko, which he would never finish. The opera was eventually completed and orchestrated by the composer Myroslav Skorik and has been performed in independent Ukraine. The fragment Leontovych left behind contains music of remarkable dramatic imagination, suggesting what his development as a composer might have become if he had lived into middle age. After Kiev fell and the Ukrainian People's Republic collapsed, Leontovych returned to Tulchin in Podillya, where he founded the first music school in the city and continued directing choral ensembles. He was a marked man, his association with the UNR government, his prominence in Ukrainian cultural life, his explicit Ukrainian national identity made him a person the new Soviet authorities regarded as a threat. He continued working despite the danger, because stopping would have meant surrendering the thing that defined his life. The night in Markivka. On the night of January 22 to 23, 1921, Leontovych was staying at his father's house in the village of Markivka. A man arrived at the door and asked to spend the night. He identified himself as an agent of the VCHK, the Chayka, the Soviet secret police. The family received him. They gave him food and warmth. In the early morning hours, the man, Afanasy Hryshchenko, shot Leontovych in his bed with a rifle. For decades under Soviet rule, the true circumstances of the murder were suppressed. Official versions attributed the killing to Petliurist bandits or random criminal violence, to anyone other than the Soviet state. The lie was useful. It allowed the Soviet cultural apparatus to simultaneously celebrate Shchedryk as a Soviet achievement and erase the man who had written it as an enemy of Soviet power. Leontovych's name could appear in music textbooks while the facts of his death were buried in classified archives. After Ukrainian independence in 1991, the archives were opened. The documentation that emerged confirmed what Ukrainian historians had long suspected: Hryshchenko was an official VCHK operative, acting under the authority of the Soviet security apparatus. The murder of Leontovych was not a robbery that went wrong. It was a political assassination of a Ukrainian cultural figure whose influence the new regime had decided to eliminate. He was 43 years old. Shchedryk had been in its final form for 2 years. Carol of the Bells, the melody that survived everything. In 1936, 15 years after Leontovych's death, the Ukrainian-American conductor Peter Wolhoski arranged an English-language version of Shchedryk for his choir at NBC. He wrote new words, "Hark how the bells/sweet silver bells," that replaced the Ukrainian text about a swallow and a generous harvest with imagery of Christmas bells. The arrangement was published and began its slow journey through American choral culture, appearing in school concerts and church services and eventually becoming one of the most recorded pieces of Christmas music in the English-speaking world. The melody's success is, in retrospect, overdetermined. The four-note figure is simple enough to be immediately memorable and harmonically neutral enough to accommodate enormous variety in arrangement. The building structure, from intimacy to grandeur and back, has an architectural satisfaction that works regardless of cultural context. Leontovych had spent 20 years refining something that turned out to be essentially indestructible. A melody that could be transplanted from Ukrainian village ritual into global Christmas commerce and retain its emotional power at every point in between. Today, Carol of the Bells generates millions of dollars annually in royalties and licensing fees. The beneficiaries are not Leontovych's descendants, since the copyright situation is complex and the original Ukrainian composition is in the public domain. What Leontovych actually left behind. The choral arrangements, the liturgy, the other 150 folk song settings, the unfinished opera, is performed in Ukraine and in Ukrainian diaspora communities around the world, appreciated by people who know the name behind the music. For everyone else, the music is simply there, every December, for notes building into a cathedral of sound, the last thing Mykola Leontovych would have expected and the most natural thing in the world.